Good morning. Thank you very much for that introduction. And Pam, thank you for your invitation to join you all here today. It really is an honor. As I heard Mr. Brown introduce me and introduce himself as a Georgetown alum and being a GW alum, I can't help but think back to when my mother, who lived in Washington State, and I came out here to DC to go to medical school. I would call her on the weekends and she would say, "How are the Hoyas doing?" Mom, I'm at the other George. Thank you. It's an honor to be with you all here today and have a chance to share my thoughts on the value and the impact of the arts in helping to heal our nation's heroes. Let me start by admitting that I don't come to this moment as someone who has been deeply involved in the arts throughout my life. Trust me, Bill can affirm this. I wish I was more artistic, but in a way, maybe my lack of artistic engagement further illuminates how profound my experience has been that I moved from this position of self-proclaimed non-artist to that of the position of ardent supporter. I'm here today as a passionate physician who's dedicated almost 2 decades to developing and implementing programs aimed at improving care for our service members, veterans, and their families as they're impacted by the wounds of war. As you heard, my last job was to be the officer in charge of the National Intrepid Center of Excellence, or NICO, up at Walter Reed. When I took this position, I knew that the NICO was the Department of Defense's clinical research center for traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress. I knew that it had an evidence-based design that made for a facility that looked like no other military treatment facility I'd ever been stationed at. I knew that it had neuroimaging equipment that would help us to look more precisely at the brain than we had ever been able to look before. And I knew that there was a clinical care model there that was based on bringing together multiple different types of providers from different medical professions into one integrated team to work collaboratively in a patient-centered way to heal these complex wounds. Now, I'm going to also admit that I knew that this position was located 2 miles from my home, and so in the Department of Defense and in the DC area, that's like hitting the jackpot of commuting jobs. So it was a no-brainer for me to say yes to taking the position of leadership there. As I became more familiar with the different medical professions that were integrated into this care team, I admit that at first I thought that it was nice that they added some neat things like a labyrinth for meditation, or an art studio, or a music room. But it didn't take long for me, however, to understand that these locations and the professional services that are offered there are definitely not just nice-to-have capabilities that sit at the fringe of a patient-centered care model, but that these were need-to-have services that are at the very core of this effective model of care and are critical to their success. As the medical advisor for Creative Forces, I usually spend a considerable amount of my time talking about the impacts and the healing capabilities of these creative arts therapies. And I will do that briefly today, but I'm going to keep the remarks on the clinical impact short so that I have time to speak to other aspects of our program. I think you heard already some of the information about the impacts of these creative arts therapies. I can tell you that in caring for patients with complex injuries, getting that patient engaged in their care is one of the most important things that you can do, having them become an active participant in their care. Creative arts therapies, by the very nature of coming into a studio and having to create, engage you in your care. And that carries over to every other discipline that these patients work with. In addition, it gives them a voice to communicate about the injuries that they maybe didn't have when you sit in traditional therapy and just talk. You get to use a different part of your brain, a different way of speaking to control your own narrative of your injuries and what you're struggling with. And lastly, I think the other thing that is so powerful and impactful of the arts is it focuses on what somebody is capable of doing, what they can create, what they can contribute, as opposed to focusing on what is broken and what isn't working. And so those things, connectivity, communication, and creativity, to me, really are the sum of why this clinical program is so important. And as you heard, our patient exit surveys reflect this. The creative arts therapies always rank among the top 4 or 5 of the 40 different clinical services that are offered as being most helpful. They're also in the top 5 of the things that patients want to continue when they leave the NICO. And while I was in charge of the NICO, offering these services consumed less than 1% of my operating budget. So they are effective and they are saving healthcare dollars. I'm excited to reiterate that through congressional funding of NEA's Creative Forces program, we have now expanded to 11 clinical sites and 1 telehealth program. We are now reaching over 2,500 new patients a year and offering over 15,000 patient encounters. So the reason I wanted to keep my remarks on the clinical effectiveness short is because, as I said, there are other aspects of Creative Forces that I also want to speak about. We believe that care and healing must extend beyond the walls of the clinic and must include community in which these families live. Creative Forces is working to build strong clinic-to-community connections in each of the locations in which we have a program. This connection, or continuum, must allow for smooth transition of people in both directions, from clinic to community, and occasionally from community into clinical care. To build and enhance this continuum at the local level, NEA's Creative Forces is working with Americans for the Arts, the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies, and the state and local arts agencies in each of our 11 sites to host community engagement summits that everybody looks forward to. The summit brings together the clinical military community and the state and local arts organizations to learn about one another. We discuss military, and trust me, military cultural competency, and for those of us in the military, we learn a lot about arts cultural competency. We learn about the clinical and the arts programs that are offered in a community, and we brainstorm about ways to break down silos and build a better continuum. For patients who have benefited from creative arts therapies, we're building relationships and asset maps that will make it easier for clinicians to help that individual find a way to stay involved in the arts when clinical care is over, much like a physical therapist might encourage someone to stay active or find a gym when they're done with their treatment. But what really excites me today is to know that this continuum is working in both directions. We know that approximately 50% of the service members and veterans who need clinical care for PTSD or psychological health injuries never seek care. They either don't know how to connect to the services or stigma prevents them from seeking help. As we build a better network, a better continuum, community arts programs play an active role in health and wellness, both through the therapeutic activities they offer, and I think you'll hear more about that today from our next speaker, but also because of the connection and the relationships that they're creating with the clinical programs. Last week, I received a call from our creative arts therapist in Tacoma, Washington, who provided a story that I think illuminates this fact. After our summit in Tacoma, the local planning team, spearheaded by the State Arts Agency in Washington, talked about how to improve clinical care in the community, how to create connections for the service members living at Joint Base Lewis-McChord. They decided to work with the State Veterans Service Office at the University of Washington's Tacoma Extension Campus. And so the creative arts therapists, a few local artists, went to the college campus and met with the officer in charge of the Veterans Service Office. They described the program of Creative Forces and set up some arts activities for students there to get them engaged. And they established a relationship of collaboration. A few weeks later, that same officer in charge called our creative arts therapist at Joint Base Lewis-McChord and said that he had a service member in trouble, in need of clinical care. Through their connection, they were able to connect the service member and his family to the clinical care he needed. The arts brought this group together and I believe that they will bring many more groups like this together across our 11 sites. I'm confident that breaking down those silos from clinical care in the military bases to the arts organizations in the communities will save lives. 11 clinical sites with strong community connections is a great start, and trust me, it's been a very, very busy year. I'm excited for the telehealth program that we are implementing because I think it will extend our reach into rural and remote areas and give them access to these services. I'm very excited about the resources that we are pulling together and putting on a national resource center that will help other communities to learn to build similar programs. Finally, I'm very excited about our research. Sustaining any kind of healthcare program, any program really, requires that evidence is in place to support the claims of effectiveness and impact. We currently have 12 research projects underway, and just last week we were informed of another article that's been accepted for publication that will bring our number of publications this last year to 5, which for a very young program is quite remarkable. In a few months, we'll be posting our research strategic framework and 5-year research agenda that grew out of a research summit we hosted earlier this year at the National Academies of Sciences that brought together leaders from creative arts therapy, behavioral health, and neuroscience. Working across this network and working with our DoD and VA partners, we are very well positioned to further explore and understand the impact of creative forces. I suspect that 2018 is going to be another very busy and exciting year. I'm absolutely thrilled to be a part of it. I thank you for your time and attention, and I thank you for all that you are doing to serve our veterans.